thought it'd be very fitting for us to talk a little bit about WeWork. Okay, so for those of you that are obviously trying to get into investment banking, which is why you follow me, I'm sure you've heard about what's been going on with WeWork, one of the highest valued technology startups. That was one of the most anticipated IPOs for 2019. They were valued at $47 billion. And then they filed to go public to raise more money because they're just bleeding cash, right? Like first 6 months of this year, they've already lost $690 million on $1.5 billion of revenue, which is crazy. If you extrapolate that out to the full year, they're probably going to lose over $1 billion, right? And so even though they raised a ton of money, they raised more than $10 billion from just SoftBank alone. Plus they have other investors that have also put money in as well. But their IPO was doing so poorly while they were marketing it that there were talks that they were going to have to go out at a $10 billion valuation. So if your investors have put in, more than $10 billion and your entire company is only going out at a $10 billion valuation, that is a very, very bad thing for your investors, right? So obviously SoftBank was like, no, we're not going to IPO. We're going to pull it. We're not going to lose this much money. And now the big question becomes, are they ever going to go IPO? Because they're obviously now they're trying to cut costs. They're going to try to they fired the CEO or pushed him out or whatever, and he became chairman. And they're going to try to basically right this ship and hopefully go IPO again, maybe, next year or in 2 years or whatever, because the investors still need to, sell their shares and realize a return on this, right? But in the meantime, since they aren't able to go IPO, they're going to have to find another way to raise money. Because again, like we said, they're losing billions of dollars a year. That means they're burning through all this cash. And if they don't find a way to raise money, the company's going to go bankrupt. Okay, so now the two options right now that they're exploring are either SoftBank puts even more money than the $10 billion that they've already put into the company, just so that because they don't want their current $10 billion investment in WeWork to go to zero, right? So that's the first option. The second option is JP Morgan, which is their primary investment banker. They might provide them with some sort of financing as well, but the terms are going to be horrible, right? It's going to be some super high yield junk bond or whatever, right? Based on how poorly they're doing. And so what does this have to do with you? Well, one, obviously you should be staying on top of the markets and you should know what's going on. And a lot of people are saying that this is a turning point in the IPO market, especially for technology companies, because historically, a lot of tech companies have been able to come out and have very successful IPOs, even if they were hugely unprofitable, right? And even if they had very questionable governance, right, at the top. Like a lot of tech company founders and CEOs, like Mark Zuckerberg and the Google founders and so on and so forth, even Adam Neumann before this whole fiasco with WeWork, they held all the power. They had basically no checks and balances, right? So that's one thing is like, hey, this is something you could potentially talk about in an interview. But more importantly, what I wanted to talk about today is actually how you should be thinking about this as far as your career is concerned, right? Because I was actually just speaking to someone earlier today who was trying to evaluate between whether they should go into investment banking or whether they should go into technology. Now, their longer term goal is always to go into technology because that's what they want to do. But they were debating whether they want to go into investment banking first and do that for a couple of years, and then maybe also do private equity after that for a couple of years before moving over to technology, right? Which is actually, I'm all for that, because that, you guys all know, that's exactly what I did, right? I worked for 3 years in banking, 2 years in private equity, did 5 years on Wall Street, and then I moved over and worked in Silicon Valley for companies like Square, for companies like GitHub, both of which had really, really successful outcomes, right? Both personally and financially, but also just like the company as a whole, right? So I think that can absolutely be a very great path. But nowadays, for the thing that I want to caution you guys against is tech has been all the rage, right? You read a lot of headlines like, oh, now all the talent is, leaving Wall Street and going to tech, or before, everybody in college or even at the MBA level wanted to go into investment banking and consulting. And then now everybody wants to go into tech, and it's like the new hot thing, right? In reality, all of this stuff is cyclical, right? Like tech is going to have booms and busts. Same with Wall Street is going to have booms and busts. And so it's easy to get caught up in the fact that, oh, tech is so sexy or whatever, and you can go in there and make so much money. But in reality, like you only make a lot of money in tech if you choose the right companies. And I know this from firsthand experience because I made a lot of money in tech. I made more money in tech than I made on Wall Street, right? I worked at, like I said, Square. I joined when they were $3 billion as a private company, the $3 billion valuation. They went public and now they're worth around $30 billion, right? I joined GitHub when they were $750 million in valuation, and they got sold to Microsoft last year for $7.5 billion, right? So both of those companies basically 10x from when I joined, right? And so the beauty of that is that whatever stock options that I got ended up 10xing in value, right? And that's why, even though I stayed at each of those places for less than a year and a half, so less than 3 years total between the two companies, my stock options in both of those companies ended up being worth 7 figures, respectively, right? So I got 2 7-figure payouts in less than 3 years. So that's what's possible with tech, and that's why so many people are like, oh yeah, tech is awesome, I want to go do tech. However, look at WeWork, right? What if I ended up at WeWork? Then right now the shares are, it says here, employees wonder if their shares have been set on fire. Like basically, because this company might go bankrupt, the employees that have shares, their shares are very likely going to be worth zero if that happens, because in a bankruptcy scenario, or even if they don't go bankrupt, if they go IPO and the valuation is really low, like it's lower than, however much money the investors have actually put into the company, like say they IPO at $10 billion, that's less than how much the company has raised, right? So what happens is that the venture capitalists that have given money to WeWork to date, they have all these protections in place. Like they have preferred shares and not common shares, which means they get paid first before the common shareholders get paid, right? And then also, like if they came in later on, like they came in Series D or Series E, like one of the later rounds, sometimes they also get like more than 1x their money, as in like, hey, if they lost money on their investment, the company has to issue them more shares to make up for that loss, right? So that what that does is that dilutes the common shareholders, which is like the employees, right? And then the worst, even worse than that, if the company doesn't go public, period, and let's say they just go bankrupt, then obviously the shares become worthless, right? So you have to understand that if you go into tech, like 9 out of 10 tech companies do not end up becoming very successful. Okay, like 9 out of 10 tech companies fail. That's the definition of a startup, right? So you always only hear about the ones who end up in companies that end up doing super well. Like, oh, I know this guy that worked at Uber, or I know this guy that worked at Lyft, or I know this guy that worked at Airbnb or Dropbox or whatever, right? Snapchat, Facebook. Because people only talk about that stuff when they're successful. The people that chose the wrong companies where their shares are worth jack shit, like they're not running around telling everybody about it, right? But even though that's the vast majority of the people, right? So if your shares are worth nothing in the technology startup that you join, I would just tell you right now, you're actually going to make a lot less money than you would from working on Wall Street. Okay, that's just how it is, right? And you know what's, and so you can't always think that you're going to make more money in tech just because that's what you read about in the news, right? Now, the other thing is that in order for you to pick the winners in tech, and so the question becomes like, okay, if I do want to do tech, how do I make a lot of money in tech, right? Well, there are 2 requirements. One is you got to know how to identify the winners. You got to know how to pick the winning companies, right? That other 10%, or ideally the 5%, because like really like the Uber home runs, like the Squares and the GitHubs and the Ubers and Lyfts and Airbnbs of the world, like that's the top 1% of the startups out there, right? So how do you pick those companies? Well, you need to learn how to think like a professional investor. You need to learn how the venture capital firms think, how the private equity firms think, how these professional institutional investors, who do they want to put their money behind? what kind of businesses do they like? And that's a lot of what you learn in investment banking, right? So that's a super, super useful skill set. Just like knowing how to think like an investor, both for your own personal investing, but also for like picking the right companies to work for, right? The second thing is you have to make yourself a desirable candidate, because these top tier startups, top tier technology companies, just because you want to work for them, so does everybody else, right? And so they're going to be very selective in terms of who they choose to work with, right? It's not like just because you want to work for them, then they're going to hire you, right? So both when I went to Square and GitHub, like when I went to Square, entire team, my entire finance and strategy team, we only hired people who have banking or PE or PE or hedge fund backgrounds. So everybody on the finance team came from Wall Street, super high caliber team, right? And then like when I went to GitHub, like, and I helped them build out the finance and strategy team, same thing. All three guys that I hired initially for the team, they all went through banking and they were all working in private equity, right? So that's the thing, is that you got to increase your own value, and that's what a lot of what you're able to do by working on Wall Street first, right? Even if you want to eventually pivot over to tech, right? And the last thing I will say is like, if you know how to pick the winners, and the winners also want to hire you, the way you make a lot of money too is you want to load up on the stock, right? So your cash compensation is going to be relatively fixed no matter what. They're not going to be able to pay you whatever cash comp you were getting on Wall Street. But the way they make up for that, if you're making a lot of money before you came in, is they give you a crap ton of stock, right? A crap ton of stock options to make up for that. Like when I went into work at Square, like I was already making over $200,000 a year in private equity. They're not going to pay me over $200,000 a year at Square in cash, because that's what like C-level executives are making, right? And I was only 5 years out of school. So I was some junior guy on a financial strategy team. So instead of paying me all of that cash, they only paid me like $90,000 in cash, but they made up for it in stock, which turned out to be a good thing, because if you know how to pick the winners, and I had conviction in Square and I felt like they were going to do extremely well, I felt like I want more stock. I would rather get paid more in stock than in cash, because I think the stock's going to go up, which is exactly what happened, right? Because the stock ended up being worth 7 figures. And like I said, I only worked there for less than a year and a half, right? And then the exact same thing played out again when I worked for GitHub. So that's kind of the takeaway that I want to leave you with, which is, I'm not saying tech is better or Wall Street is better. I'm just saying like you need to go in with your eyes wide open, right? Like tech is not always better than Wall Street, just because that might be what you're reading in the news right now, and vice versa too. It's not like later on you'll probably read that, Wall Street's better than tech. It's not always the case either, but you should be really thinking about how can you position yourself for the best outcome, right? Whether that's by increasing your own value or increasing your own knowledge, both of which investment banking is going to, and private equity or hedge funds or whatever, working on Wall Street for a few years out of school is going to allow you to do that. Okay, so after that, you want to pivot to tech, you're going to get a much better result than if you just went to tech straight out of school. That's my opinion, and that's from my personal experience as well, right? That is part of the exit opportunities that people always talk about when they talk about investment banking, right? So anyway, that's my thought of the day Tuesday for you guys, and hope that helps. And let me know if you guys have any questions. All right, I will talk to you guys soon.